Hello, everyone, and I'd like to start this webinar now. This is the third edition of the series of the Stages of Cow series. It's going to be the last red calf themed one. Next time we're going to transition over to the fourth stage, which is then kind of your young stock heifer barn, just as a little outlook here. So today we're going to focus on calves. And how to build calf barns. We're getting a lot of questions on that, so we thought we'd dedicate a whole webinar to that. Just as a little introduction on the functions of this webinar, we're gonna present a little presentation and our thoughts on like what's important to consider in calf barn design, but then there will be an allocated time for questions for either one of us, and you're welcome to use the Q&A section. So if you use your cursor and like go all the way up or down, depends a little bit on your system, then there will be a pop-up bar and you can type in a question in the dedicated Q&A section, and we're gonna get to it later. You can also use the chat, but it's a little easier for us to use the Q&A section because then it's just a little bit more organized and we can see which ones we already did and which not. Feel free to type in questions at any time. We're gonna get to it at the end. And yeah, if you wanna interact with the other participants, feel free to use the chat because they can see the chat. We can only see. We're the only ones who can see the question section. Okay, at the beginning, I want to introduce ourselves. So my name is Nele. I'm the vet of AgriComfort. I think most people that have joined webinars before have seen me. So not much I want to say really about me. I would like to introduce my guest speaker or my fellow speaker here, Dr. Ryan Leiterman.
Thanks.
Hi, Ryan.
Thanks for having me on.
We're actually here at his facility at your office in Crystal Creek in Wisconsin, United States right now, just so people know that. Ryan, tell us a little bit about yourself. What is it that you do? Why are you qualified to talk on this webinar today?
Sure. So my name is Ryan Leiterman. I'm a veterinarian and I specialize in calf barn ventilation. I've done it for the last 12 years. I have an undergraduate degree in engineering. My professional degree is in veterinary medicine. And yeah, it's really a passion of mine. Fresh cow performance and calf barn ventilation are my two greatest areas of professional interest. And spent a lot of time working with calf barns over the last decade or more now, and made some advancements on the way we ventilate them. And I think we can talk about that. And although my specialty is ventilation, I've been involved in hundreds of new calf barn builds, and I've learned a lot from my clients over those years, and looking to share that knowledge today.
Yeah, that's great. So as a disclaimer, maybe since Ryan is an American veterinarian, this might be a little bit more of an American version of calf barns that you're going to see here and that we're going to discuss. I'm trying to bring in a little bit of my context coming from Germany, so like the Middle European kind of concept. But you and I have both been involved in international projects, right? I'm aware that you build a couple barns or help design a couple barns in Japan right now.
Yep.
So, and I did like Russia and the Middle East and other countries. So we try to make this, because we know we have a broad audience, try to focus on anything, but I think it's a little bit the American idea of things.
I do think, having been fortunate enough to travel around the world and see calf barns in quite a few different countries, the climates are different. That is one thing that has to be acknowledged. But the way that the barns are generally being built, I see a lot of the same good principles repeated over, and I see a lot of the same mistakes repeated over, whether it's a barn in Japan, Russia, the Netherlands, or Western Wisconsin. I think there's still a lot of similarities that would be applicable on the design and the layout of it, even though the climates might be different.
And I like to agree on that, because when we look at dairy barns on like real, like, let's say like almost industrial sized, real good dairy barns, they tend to be pretty similar all over the world by now. People like get in like American, Danish, Dutch kind of designers for projects all over the world. And of course you have to acknowledge the climatic differences, but generally they are looking relatively the same, very open and stuff like that, free stalls. And in calf barns, I feel like sometimes people are not having this broadest view on calves generally. They're like, oh no, for calves, it's totally different here. And I think this might be a good opportunity to kind of share thoughts. What is all similar and what are kind of like the same considerations no matter where you're at, and kind of maybe the little lookouts, like what to watch out for in your different home country and climate. Okay. Well, I would like to start with a little interaction here. So all of my participants, I would like to ask you a question. Are you planning to build a barn right now? Is that something you're looking into? I just try to get like a feeling of who's here today to make this the most valuable like use of your time. So just if anybody, feel free to answer that. So Ryan, do you see a lot of barn projects happening right now or being in the pipeline? Kind of what's the status right now here?
From what I've seen in the United States, our growth in calf barns has been slow over the last 2 to 3 years because of a depressed milk price. But I've actually seen since January of this year, a tremendous flurry of activity and people building calf barns. I think that many of these projects were delayed and they just can't be delayed much more. Banks are lending money at a very low interest rate, and we just see a lot of movement on people executing new barns this year.
I actually have kind of the same feeling that like COVID helped some people a little back on projects a little bit. Last year they were like, let's just take a damper on it. But now that building material prices rose up so crazy and then now dropped slightly, people are like, well, maybe we make the move because it's not gonna go down, it's probably gonna go up again. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I can show you those results. So quite a few of our listeners seem to not be planning a project right now, about half of the people that answered, but that's okay. There seems to be still good interest. And maybe this is also like other people that are listening in here that are also in the advising position or something for their region. But you can see that there's also quite a few people who are planning or who are retrofitting or considering barns. On the question if you should consider a barn or not, my colleague Robert and I did a webinar on this last year. I'm going to link it in the when we upload this later to YouTube. I'm going to just link it there, and I'm going to write a follow-up email with all the webinars that we're going to mention throughout this. Okay, so why would you even build a barn? We saw that a couple of people answered that they're not 100% sure if the barn is the right solution for them or not. So I just wanted to discuss this a little bit. So what is usually the idea of why does a farmer decide to build a barn? And he usually has a couple hopes, and it usually starts with, oh, it's so much nicer to feed calves and like take care of them, which is a daily or multiple times a day chore. And especially if you're in a climate that's maybe wet and cold or extremely hot, it might be very unpleasant for the feeders to go out there and feed the calves multiple times a day. So that's one of the main drivers, that the labor is less and more pleasant. And then another main driver is that people really hope for better conditions for their calves. So they're not as much in the rain, they're not as much in the snow, and also they are not as cold. And that's where I put the question mark here. We're going to discuss this a little bit later, if this is really something that you should be worried about, was the calf being cold or not. But I would say those are the two main objectives.
Yeah, and I think just one thing I can say real quick is, I think it's very common for people building barns, their primary concern is the comfort of the people in the barn. And I would encourage people to just step back and recognize these calves are going to live in this barn 24 hours a day. Your feeders are going to operate in this barn probably somewhere between 2 to 6 hours a day. I think the primary consideration, this barn needs to be designed around the comfort of the calf first. And as much as it pains me to say, the comfort of the human second. And all too often, I see a lot of barns that are designed for the comfort of the human first, and then the the condition of the calf second. And I think that that's a really important thing.
That's true.
To point out.
In that webinar that I just mentioned, Robert and I pointed out that it's very important to take care of your workers. You want good people to take care of your calves. It's an important part of an important chore on the farm, and you want something who's on the job and like focuses on the calves and does a really good job. So that should not be minimized, and it's important that they're comfortable and well, but maybe like a nice office or like a nice warming room where they can be dry and have a coffee in between feeding the calves would also do the trick instead of like giving them a warm barn to work in.
Yeah.
Like, something like that. Okay, so but coming into this, like, so what are the actual benefits for the calves now being in this in a barn? What can a barn offer them? And it is definitely that they're protected from the rain, sun, snow, and sun. And depending on the design of the barn, they're also protected from the cold. But if they really need that, or if it should be like that, we will discuss in the ventilation. We don't really think that that is something you should design your barn around, but protection from moisture, especially, and intensive sun exposure, that is definitely something a barn can offer. Then you have the option of very regulated ventilation, versus in a hutch, you are kind of like only natural ventilating, and you're depending on the climatic conditions there, and it can sometimes be not as ideal. In a barn, you have the option to regulate everything and have it under control, but you also have the obligation. You have better infrastructure, running water and electricity, and sorry, and you have the better possibility to manage how the drainage under the pens is looking like. With hutches, it's sometimes very hard to manage to have a nice drainage. And of course, you have the close proximity to the calf kitchen, everything kind of close together, no long travel ways and stuff like that. But I think pretty obvious. So what is it that a calf actually needs? So when we were talking before about a calf should be protected from all those things, when you look at this list that was already published by Davis and Drakely in 1998 in a magazine, they talk about properly ventilated, access to feed and water, dry bedding, possibility of handling and treatment, and easy to clean and sanitize. They're not talking at all about warmth or anything like that. What the calf needs is important here with the bedding. That is the insulation that the calf is depending on to keep itself warm when it's really, really cold. But we don't need to offer the calf like a warm environment, like a heated house or something like that.
Yeah, I think a common misconception is, and one thing to be perfectly clear on is we do not want cold calves. Okay, we want warm, healthy, snuggly calves.
Yep.
But we don't believe that the barn has to be heated to do that. It's very possible. I live in Wisconsin where we have very bitterly cold winters, and the vast majority of our calf barns are not insulated, and it's just as cold inside the barn as it is outside the barn. But it's possible to have very healthy, warm calves with good bedding, jackets, lots of calories, and just not heating the barn.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree with that. So when we talk about ventilation as the first main requirement that a calf is asking for, dry, draft-free, ventilated barn, we kind of have two options: natural, mechanical ventilation. And you, as the expert, I would like what is it that you're looking out for in those two aspects, natural and mechanical ventilation?
Yeah, so there's really three different types of ventilation. There's natural ventilation, which requires zero fans. There's 100% mechanical ventilation, which can only uses fans, and there's no curtain to unroll. And then there's probably what I would see as the most popular designs nowadays are the hybrid systems, which are a combination of some natural ventilation and some supplemental mechanical ventilation to cover the requirements for all four seasons. I think those are the most popular and oftentimes maybe the more successful options. So with natural ventilation, what we're looking for, well, with really any ventilation system, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
We have our lights on a timer, and if I don't move around enough, apparently the lights shut up. What you're looking for is good, clean, quality air at the animal level to breathe. That is, the goals of ventilation is to remove accumulated heat, moisture, bacteria, and noxious gases like ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, stuff like that. And we can achieve that with natural ventilation with open curtains, as long as that fresh air moves across the animal space, dilutes out all of those nasty things that we want to remove. That's really the goal. If you're going to use natural ventilation, I think it's important to pour a low knee wall. Knee wall is a piece of concrete that the bedding rests up against. And
you can see here in this picture down here.
Doesn't matter where I travel in the world, I see a lot of places that want to pour that 4 feet tall, 6 feet tall, 1 meter, 1.5 meters, 2 meters. And what I've seen to be more successful is a 2 foot or 3/4, or 2/3, half, 3/4 meter type high wall, no higher. And I think what you'll see in the picture here that I really want to point out, they can see the picture here.
I think so, yeah.
Is that if you look at this animal laying on the bedded pack, her nose is dead even with this open curtain that fresh air can come in and hit her right in the face. If this concrete wall was much taller, it would provide a significant wind shadow and fresh air would not get to the animal level. We don't need to ventilate the entire barn per se. We need to ventilate the portion of air that the animals breathe. And that's typically, 2 meters and below is the air that matters the most to us. For baby calves, a meter 50.
Maybe even mainly focus on like 50 centimeters to a meter above the straw pack, because they're laying quite a bit of the day.
And that's where a lot of the gases will accumulate.
Yeah, so what I wrote down here is like open side walls like this with curtains, netting curtains to break the wind are nice. And then maybe curtains that come up from that, not just like roll down from the top down, but also roll from the bottom up, or even only do that if you don't want to have 2 motors, because the ones that come from the top down, that is basically a rich ventilation at the top, and especially baby calves, they just don't create that kind of natural thermic to draw out the heat like a dairy cow would in a barn. So having this top open helps to ventilate the rafters and the top of the barn, but not down where the calves are at.
Right. One of the biggest mistakes I make is people putting curtains that can only roll from the top down. And for calf barns, I think having a curtain that can roll from the bottom up allows you to get that fresh air at the animal level, right in the nose where they're breathing.
Yeah, and even if that's just a small gap that you're opening up there, it comes right at the right spot, kind of. Yeah, and then we look at aspects of mechanical ventilation. What is it that you're looking out for?
Yep, mechanical ventilation is where we're going to use fans to move air through the barn. There's 2 broad categories. There's negative pressure ventilation, where we essentially create a suction and we draw air through the barn using exhaust fans. Then there's positive pressure ventilation, where we push air into the barn, commonly done with these ventilation tubes, as you see here, and we can direct the air into the calf pens there. The important points are it has to be draft free when it's cold. So to use some US numbers here, when it's below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the air has to be moving slower than 60 feet per minute. Some metric numbers would be, I think it's when it's below 15 Celsius, the air needs to be moving less than 0.3 meters per second.
Yeah, a draft is defined as anything 0.4 and faster, but we really know that a draft is always the combination of like air speed, size of the animal, and temperature that we are at right now. It's a perceived thing. If you want to learn more about this, Ryan and I, over a year ago, we did a webinar on this topic, and I'm also going to link it in the video description.
One thing I'd like to point out too is I've talked to farmers in very hot climates before, and I think there's a lot of confusion about a draft.
Yeah.
And I'll talk to people. I remember distinctly one barn I was in, and it was like 32 Celsius. I'm just sweating, just standing there. And I'm talking to the farmer about we should get some fast air on these calves to help cool them. And he said, "Oh, I don't want calves to have a draft." And I thought, like, dude, it's 32 Celsius. Yeah. It's okay to have a draft. And so drafts are only problematic when it's cold. But again, when we get above that 75 or 77 Fahrenheit, that draft, don't think about it as a draft anymore. Think about it as cooling. In the same manner that we provide fast air for cooling with our cows, calves can benefit from fast moving air. And typically we target greater than 2 miles an hour. So if we can get between 2 and 5 miles an hour, I think that works out something to be like 3.2 and 9 kilometers per hour. If we can get air that fast on the calf, that can really help them cool, and it helps with fly pressure, and it keeps their bedding and environment drier as well. Yeah. There's a lot of benefits for fast moving air in hot weather. Typically try to target greater than 2 miles an hour or 3.2 kilometers per hour.
I think that's about 1 meter per second. It's usually the rate that's used. There's a lot of numbers that we're throwing out here right now. Again, we did a webinar on this where we explain all of this a little bit more in detail. So when you plan something like this and to decide, do I need a natural or mechanical or hybrid system, the really question that almost comes before that, I just put it on top because ventilation is so important for the calves. But the question that you as a farmer or the person who plans and designs the barn need to answer before is like, what is the layout of my barn going to look like? And there's a couple of key questions that you need to ask yourself to come to that kind of question. So first, it is really important to just like, or determine how many calves are actually in this barn at a time and like over the course of a period of time. So usually you would look at like how many calves are in there at any given moment and then over the course of a year. I like to look at numbers like how many calves are born within a week, break it down to one day and then kind of like do the conversion of like how many are there a week. And then you can look at how long will they stay in it and calculate that to how many weeks that is, and then see what kind of number you're coming up with. It gives you a really good idea and also gives you an idea of like how many turnovers you kind of have in this barn over this period of time.
One thing I learned a long time ago is if you build a barn on average numbers, if you're going to average 30 Holstein calves a month, and then you say we're going to have them in there for 2 months, so I need capacity for 60 heifers, you're going to be under capacity quite often.
Yes.
And so don't work on averages. One thing I found is take your average number and you can multiply it anywhere from 1.2 up to even 1.4.
Yep.
And that'll help you handle the calving burst because we know cows don't calve in evenly every month. Yep. Oftentimes there's slugs where we have a lot. And that multiplying factor between 1.2 and 1.4 100%. Will help you accommodate those slugs.
Absolutely, because if you look at your farm data, by now most farms are equipped with very good data tracking, especially in the dairy cow area, and then you can see your birthing patterns because it's not always the same. The conception rate is not always the same. It's very natural for a cow to have kind of like a seasonal pattern to it, and we would like to make it as even as possible if we have continuous calving, but it is not always playing out like that. Then there's like variables like maybe you have cows that are better genetically and you want to use sex semen, and all of a sudden now you have a higher percentage of replacement calves being born, even though the same number of calves been born this month. So there's a certain number of variants that you have to consider. So 1.2 to 1.3 of your average is probably a pretty good rate. And the other thing that I like to consider is at least 10% capacity buffer on top of that for cleaning. So that you always have a certain amount of your pens being empty to have some time to clean them and maybe even let them sit cleaned and empty for a while to really make sure that those infectious chains are broken before you put a new calf in there. And then after you decided that and like kind of determine what's my capacity, what is really what I want for this barn, you need to decide like how long is the calves are going to stay in there, and then split those calves in functional groups to decide what arrangement of pens you want. Do I want to start with baby calves in individual pens, or do that they are like just in there for a couple of days and or maybe in a hutch outside, and then they come in the barn and I want to put them in a group pen? Or do I have a barn, which is what we saw in the pictures before, where it's like individual pens and maybe then a double pen till the end of the weaning period, and really after they're weaned, they go into a group. All of that is different things that you need to consider. I really like what I showed, kind of tried to symbolize in this little drawing here. When you start your calves after they were in a newborn station, like what we explained in the last 2 webinars ago, I think, and then they come into an individual pen for a little while till the immune system is a little bit more built up. And then it is possible to remove one of those side walls, and that's kind of what I tried to symbolize here, to make it a double pen. And then you can have 2 calves together as their little mini group. They're already experiencing some mild competition for their feed and just learn to live in a group and start to socialize, but they don't have that big germ pressure from a big group on an automatic feeder. Sometimes I see groups like 25 cows on one automatic feeder, and they get in there as early as 10 days. And that can be really rough on that calf, because that calf is going through its immunological gap, while another calf in that group already went through it, has a pretty solid immune system, and that's the nature of things, just shedding germs at a very, very high rate. And that calf is within the same pen as that other calf, and they're just experiencing a lot of germ pressure that they wouldn't need to experience if they are in a smaller unit while they're still having the benefit of socializing. Mm-hmm. And then if you have maybe a group pen, like what I try to symbolize here, for bigger calves, maybe post-weaned calves, when you look at this, how to arrange pens like that, I like to think about what I would call a calf flow, how they move through the barn, and also how the workers move through a barn. In a previous life, I used to be a pig for, sorry, a veterinarian for pigs. Oh my God. And there it is a very big thing that you always move through the whole farm from the youngest, from the like most vulnerable, immunological naive pigs to the oldest, which are the most stable from the immune system, but also shed the most germs, to make sure that you are not the vector that transport those germs from the old pigs to the young pigs. And kind of that same mindset would work really well for a calf barn, having the young calves in a designated area at one side that you go in first with your clean boots and your clean hands, take care of them, and then you can kind of move down to the area with the older calves and take care of them, and do not have to go back to the young calves again, or pass by their pens to get to the milk kitchen to take care of the older calves, for example. So if you have a layout like this, it would be a good idea to have the calf kitchen, like, I hope somebody can see my cursor, like here in the middle. So you don't need to pass by, like if it would be here at the top end of the barn, for example, every time you want to fill out a bucket or like get maybe like a syringe with a shot for a calf in the big pen, you have to go by the baby calves after you just been in the big pen with the calves to find that sick calf, and all the calves slobbered all over you, and now you're just walking past the baby calves. That's a really bad idea. So if you're building a new barn, use that advantage, be smart about it, and kind of like think about your pathways and how you're walking, and also how you want to move the calves to kind of have a one-way street, so to say. Yeah, and then when you're planning the pens, of course, it's important to think about, like, after you have the general layout in your mind, now you have to decide how big is each of those pens, like how big is the individual pen, how big is the group pen, how much, that really depends on, like, in the individual pen, like how long is the calf staying in there. So obviously a 2-week-old calf needs less space than a 2-month-old calf, so you just kind of have to allocate that. And then I always advise, go once, like define what you want, and then go one step up.
Sure.
Because it is not a lot of space and not a lot of cost involved at this to like go bigger at this point, and you never know what the regulations are. In Europe, we had a lot of struggle with that the regulations kind of like stepped up partly year to year to year, and farmers that were smart and like kind of planned for this and did not just do what was recommended at this point in time, but like kind of like thought ahead and did one step bigger, were really well off when the next step came. And then when you think about group pens, and that's something I learned from you to like heavily look out for, don't maybe do something like this, because this is really basically one big group and not two groups. Like from an epidemiologic standpoint, this is one group because those calves can all touch each other, lick each other, and that is really just a physical barrier, but not any barrier of like groups in any mean. So it makes sense if you want to use gates like that, maybe put them at like 2 feet distance to each other so the calves can't reach each other, or make them solid gates, solid walls, so the calves can't lick each other. They're still in the same air volume, so aerosols can still travel from one pen to another, but most of the transmission of disease is not through the air, it's actually through touch and fluids.
I think one thing we can go back to quick is, I really like the idea. So I learned this from a farmer client of mine in southern Wisconsin. Oftentimes you can take that picture, and many guys will replace the gates with a poured concrete wall. that while that will stop the calves from touching each other, it really kills air quality down at the calf level, and it becomes much harder. You know, the more concrete we pour and the higher we pour it, the harder it is to ventilate the airspace where the calf lives. And so I had a farmer in southern Wisconsin that instead of pouring a concrete wall, he did open gating like what you see in this picture, but he put a 3-foot walk alley.
3 foot,
yeah. 1 meter walk alley in between the calves. And that did a lot of things. Yes, it added some square footage to his barn, and it did increase cost, but it kept the calves separated so they wouldn't touch, but it did not obstruct airflow. And it gave his workers a really easy flow through the barn. The easier it is for workers to look at calves and maneuver through the barn and get the calves, the more likely they are to spot sick ones earlier and get them treated more quickly. And so not only did we get a win from separating the calves, but we got easier flow through for the staff, the workers, and we did not interfere with air quality. So it was a lesson that I learned. I think we've repeated it on many barns since and had very good success with it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that input. Yeah, I think that's very important. And then another thing that I see in quite some barns is like those shared drinkers in like, there's a gate and then kind of the gate is over the middle of the drinker, so both pens can reach into it, but it's one big tub. It was an automatic valve. And that's great because that saves cost in the beginning. But that's kind of the only
benefit. Not great.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's not great.
It's a terrible idea.
It's about the only benefit you have, because again, you're making like this big pod that all the calves like dunk their nose in, which is one of their main like germ shedding holes. And the bacteria will live in the water and just be like on the side of the feeder. And then all the calves kind of inevitably will get infected with whatever one calf had at the beginning. So at least to keep it inside that one group, make the drinker just accessible for one group. I saw it at one farm in Russia who did it really nicely. They had those big pens, and then the drinkers were right in center of each pen, kind of in the middle. It really was no option for calves of other groups to reach for that pen, and I really like that. Yeah, and then another really big topic that I like to talk about with farmers is how do I need drainage? And if so, how do I plan it? And I think the really very direct and easy answer is yes, you should definitely plan for drainage. There's a lot of fluid coming out of those calves. You usually say like a gallon, like 4 liters per calf per day in just urine fluid. So if you have 100 calves in this barn, it adds up to quite a bit. You always say it's like kind of like when you look at the drain pipe, it's not like a dribble, it's really like a stream, like a constant stream of urine, and that is a lot of fluid. So your bedding would, if you don't have drainage, your bedding would need to absorb that. It would also evaporate into the air and increase the humidity, again being bad for the temperature humidity index and like heat stress situations, but also just being hard on the lungs, just hard on the overall, on the equipment. Everything rusts more easy if it's very humid in the barn. And if it drains, it usually, if you use long stem straw that has a relatively low absorbent quality, it takes some time for the straw to really absorb moisture like that. So if a calf pees on it, it just runs through, and if the drainage is right there, it runs into the drain and is out of it, and the straw still keeps its absorbing quality and stay dry and insulating for the calf.
Yeah, this is something really important to me. I see it done wrong dozens of times a year. And the problem with concrete is once it's poured, it's semi-permanent and it's expensive to remove. And so on the left, you'll see the picture of a drain where the drain is centered underneath the pen itself. If the pen is 7 feet long, the drain is located in the middle, and all the urine and waste, liquid waste in that pen goes underneath the drain in the pen and goes out of the barn. And the important part is the feed alley where the workers walk back and forth in remains dry. Now, if you look at the picture on the right, I took a picture of this on a farm. Very many people will put the drain in the center of the feed alley. Well, what's the water going to do? The water is going to leave the calf pen, or the urine or the manure. Just imagine all this has salmonella or E. coli or other pathogens in it, and it's going to flow right across where the workers move their feeding equipment, and they're going to spread this salmonella and this urine and this manure all throughout the barn. And if there's one thing that I could stop from ever happening again, nobody would build a barn with that type of drain on the right, where the drain should never be located in the center of the feed alley, or else you are encouraging all that liquid waste to flow into the work area and then be spread all across the barn. Yeah. I see this in dozens of barns. It's a terrible idea, and I hope that our participants from this webinar, if there's a couple things that they can take away, is do not put the drain in the middle of your work alley, or else you will encourage all of that disgusting liquid waste to be in the work alley, and that's not where we want it. You're far better served to put the drain underneath the calf pen.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially this is a barn, the left picture is a barn of a client of mine in Germany. And they did this actually after hearing a talk of you at the European Calf Conference. And this is really nice. It's a little hard to see, but you can see that if you look at a profile of this barn, it basically looks like this under the pen, like a V. So the front of the pen and the back of the pen like sits on the points of the V, and then the middle, the center of the pen is the deepest point where this drainage is that's filled with gravel to keep the straw out. And then the front and the center alley where the people are walking is sloped again and has a center drain for any kind of, like, maybe there's a bucket that was spilled or something like that. And also for just like washing the barn when the pens are removed. So they have 3 drains, but the waste and all the manure, urine is going never into the walk alley. It stays underneath the pen. And what's important there is that it's not just a little bit of a drainage grade. Some people are worried about the stability of the pens. You don't have to, as long as the front and the back are on even ground. The middle, the side panels don't have to touch the ground in the middle. It's okay. You really want to go with an aggressive grade because the concrete is rough. Urine, we're not talking hundreds of liters that are flowing through it. It's relatively small amounts of fluids. So we want to drain them out fast. We don't want them to like basically stick on the concrete. So we're usually recommending a 3 to 8% grade in the flooring to get that moisture out of there. And then something that I discussed with a client of mine in Germany before, which I saw was a very nice idea. It's an expensive solution, no doubt, but there's like those nice pre-made concrete pipes, basically, like they're like multiple parts, and you lay them together, and then you have a very nice flushable drain. Or also if you have a drain like this, but under the pen with a grate on top of it, you might be able to flush it out to like to not have any waste building up, manure building up down there with straw bedding pieces and stuff like that. That might be a good harboring ground for bacteria.
The old way we used to do it would be the picture on the left with the gravel-filled trench with the drain tile below it. A lot of calf barns being built now are not utilizing that, and they're just making a concrete trench, and they leave it open with a metal grate on top, and then it still provides the same concept as drainage, but they can flush it with a hose afterwards. The gravel, you can have to, after a couple of years, dig that up and replace it with new gravel. So if you just build the concrete trench with a grate on top, it's flushable. You don't worry about the gravel plugging up. And I think it's a little better. You know, we've evolved over the last few years how we do this, and I think that's even a next step up from the gravel-filled trench.
Exactly. The idea with the gravel was that no bedding goes into it, it's not a place where rats maybe can live and stuff like that. But if you flush out an open trench regularly, it should be relatively clean and not so nice for rats.
The people that I have, they bed their straw bedding on top of the metal grating. They have a diamond plate grate with a 1/2-inch opening on it, and they bed, and the calves stay in there 2 months. When they're done, they tear out the pens, they clean off the bedding, they pull up the metal grates, and they flush it out. And the bedding doesn't go through the 1/2-inch expanded metal grates.
There you go. Okay, let's keep moving along here. So then, of course, the next really important question you need to ask yourself is like, how do I want to organize the milk feeding as a daily chore? I mean, of course, they also need water and grain, but the milk feeding is kind of your big like logistic task. Jason Hatfield and I talked a little bit about it, how to organize bottle feeding of really big calves. in the last webinar, and you can also utilize that in barns with the same trailers and stuff like that. But you could also use buckets and group feeders. But obviously, another very common solution is that people would choose as automatic feeders. Also a big common design idea for barns. When we talk about the buckets, like shown here in this picture, it's important that you allocate a position for them so you can hang them easily and they're the right height for the calf. But then the really important part is like, where do they go after feeding? Where do I clean them? Where do I store them in between feeding? Is it as easy as to hang on the outside of the pen, which I don't love that much because the calves can still reach them and lick them and like maybe kick them off. It would be better if you have like a rack or something like that in your calf kitchen. So after washing them, you can hang them upside down so they can dry and be stored in a safe spot. But you need to consider what kind of buckets, how big are they, and what kind of facility do I need to wash and clean them. And if you want to go with an automatic feeder, then the question is, where do I put it in the barn? How do I design it? And you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I've seen, again, I think the top picture is a very common setup. What you'll see is you'll have a calf feeding stall, and then and it is placed directly adjacent to a gate or some type of obstruction. People do this because it's easier when training new calves on the auto feeder to herd them into the feeding stall, because you have a barrier on one side, so you can just naturally push them in on the other. The problem is that really limits calf entry if it's a timid calf. And so I don't like the way that the top picture shows a calf stall. The only way that a calf can get into that is directly from the back or on one side. If there's a more dominant calf anywhere around the area, a timid calf may not have easy access or entry into that feeding stall. Conversely, the picture on the bottom shows a calf stall where it's completely wide open. There's no gate associated next to the side of the pen. Calves can enter from the left, the right, the front. They can access anywhere they want in that feeding stall. It's much more open and it's much more usable to the bottom 25% smaller, more timid calves that might struggle to get in there.
Yeah, like one strong calf will have a really hard time defending this milk feeder.
Correct.
Because sometimes the strong calf even will learn that the necklace of the calf will start the drinking, like the milk releasing process, and they let them go in and then they kick them out. Sure. To like steal their milk. I've seen that happening myself, and they will have a hard time doing that here, while this might be easier for that strong calf to bully that calf out.
Right. I think one thing too is I've heard people, I've talked to people about this concept, and an argument or counterpoint that I'll get back is they'll say, yes, but it's easier for my workers if the feeding station is located up against a gate, because it's easier for them to herd the new calves in for training. And my counterpoint back to that is always, again, your workers are in that pen for 1 to 2 hours a day. These calves are in that pen for 24 hours a day. We need to build the feeding station to the benefit of the calf more than the benefit of the employee.
And also, there's nothing stopping you from maybe having like a little herding board that you have was like maybe like some clamping mechanism for that situation that you put on there, so you have that kind of like gate in that situation.
Yeah, we have a client with a system just like the bottom picture, very open access, and they custom welded a foldable gate that when not used can be folded up and put along the side of the feeding station, and when needed is grabbed, extended out, and the animal can be herded in, and then when not used, folded up and put back.
Yeah. So just be smart about it and don't be like, oh, for this one situation, I need that. Rather think about what can we do to make it work 24/7, and then find a solution for that one training situation or cleaning situation, whatever it is. Yeah. And then my last point that I want to go on to here is that after planning all of that, just always have the sanitation aspect of it in mind and kind of have a plan for it. I think we already brought up a couple ideas here with like flushing the trenches and like how to maybe have the penning with like extra capacity for cleaning and all of that. But just kind of like think about those 4 points that I want to give you as like a take-home message. Think about your newborn calf. What is happening with your newborn calf right after it's born? Again, we did a webinar on this whole topic, but if you plan a calf barn already, you are considering a warming area for a calf, or like a newborn station type of deal where you want to be able to put up like a heating lamp like this and just kind of get the newborn calf started. Just consider that this is an area that basically then every calf of your barn will go through, and it's a warm, moist environment, so perfect for bacteria growth. And it's very easy to have a bad bacteria in there if you don't have a good sanitation program for it. And then literally every calf of your barn is going to get infected with that. And so it's very crucial, if you're planning something like that, to plan it right and to have like a heavy focus on the sanitation of that area. And then what are you doing with your milk preparation area? Like how is it, like what is the kind of cleaning schedule for that? Is there like enough drains on the floor? Are they like good locations? You don't want to have like any water pooling on the floors at any place, or like any equipment that's too heavy to move, that's like maybe blocking an area that you can never wash. All of that needs to be considered before planning or before building. Again, when the concrete's poured, it's kind of poured, and that's what you're stuck with. Another aspect that I like to consider or like suggest to people is like maybe to consider putting in a water sanitation system, depending on if you're well water or if you're like plugged up to the city system. You might have very, very good or poor water quality to begin with. And even if you have good water quality, just consider it's a pretty big barn. There's going to be pipes, and all of that will have water standing in it, and not that much of flow through. Mm-hmm. It is not a dairy barn where each dairy cow drinks like 100 liters every day. Yes, you need water for feeding the calves and like preparing the milk and washing, but that's kind of it. It's kind of comes in periods. There's not a constant flow, so there's a lot of like stagnant water, and baby calves are very vulnerable. So maybe water sanitation would be a good place to consider a water sanitation system. And then the next and last thing would be plan for how to wash all of your equipment. How do you wash if you have an automatic feeder, how do you wash the whole station? How do you wash the gates between the group pens? And how do you wash the penning? And there I just want to kind of like advise to not plan on washing it while in the barn while other calves are present, or especially present in close proximity. Because when you're washing, you're creating a lot of aerosols, especially if you're washing with a power cleaner. And that all that bacteria that was like safely kind of like stuck to that equipment at that time will now be blasted into the air as an aerosol and kind of floats around the whole barn when you're cleaning in a barn. And the calves that are still in the barn can breathe that in, and that can damage their lungs and get them infected with things that you really didn't want them to be infected with. All of that can be prevented if you have systems like, for example, this little newborn calf station. This can be wheeled outside of the barn because it's not fixed into the barn, and then you can clean it outside and you prevent all of that aerosol spreading inside the barn. So it's just clever planning like that for relatively small things that make your life a lot easier in the long run. So to come to a conclusion of this, you really should evaluate your needs first. Find out what's the maximum calf number, not just the average, and plan for another buffer for like kind of unexpected variations in calving patterns and whatever, and then plan an extra cleaning capacity to always have pens and places that can be empty for cleaning. Then you should plan for a good calf flow through the barn so that your youngest and most vulnerable calves are not right next to the older ones, and also plan for kind of a gradient transition to prepare them from being a single little individual calf to living in a herd of dairy cows one day. And then obviously you need to find your own solutions for your barn, but have the key things in mind there that you focus on: having a good ventilation system, plan for to have like good dry bedding with a proper drainage system. How do you want to feed and clean that feeding system, and then plan for a sanitation program. Okay, so let's move on to the question section. I already saw a couple of questions pooling in. So that's the end of the presentation that we wanted to share with you guys. If anything was left open at this point, please feel free to type it in, and we're gonna go through the questions now. No? Okay, there's a question. So we kind of like dug in onto heat abatement. I guess it's because it's July and it's really cold outside. Sorry, hot outside right now. But there's a question. Noel brought up the point that we actually have quite a few customers that repeatedly ask us if they should put in a heating system for the winter. So what is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we deal with it a lot. Granted, I live in Wisconsin, so in the Midwest, we get cold temperatures. I do a fair amount of work in Canada. So a lot of my life in calf barn ventilation is dealing with cold weather. And what I found is cold weather is more of a human problem, and specifically it's more of a human psychology problem. Okay, so can calves be raised well in a non-heated cold barn? The answer is absolutely yes. So when people say, I'd like to heat my barn, they might have this conception that they need to add heat for calf health, but we really don't. In fact, if you just look at calves raised in outdoor hutches, they are by far some of the healthiest calves that we have, even in the Midwest during cold temperatures. So the barn, we want a warm calf. The calf goal should always be to be warm. The question is how we do it. And I found the best way is keep the barn cold, do not put in any supplemental heat, but keep the calf warm through a lot of long stem straw bedding, calf jackets, and calories. Specifically, when we're starting to get in very cold temperatures like below 20 below Fahrenheit type stuff at night, getting between 5,000 and 6,000 calories a day into calves that are 3 weeks of age or greater is very important. And that's typically can be achieved with a gallon of milk in the morning, gallon of milk at night, and then typically somewhere between a pound of calf starter. That's going to deliver somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 calories, depending on the milk or milk replacer and calf you've used.
And you can also do other little things like calories is energy. So it can be in the form of like fat and whatever is in the food, but you can also raise the temperature, the feeding temperature of the milk a little bit to like not take energy out of the calf or to warm it up. And it can be even a little bit above body temperature to give them like a little bit like of a hot drink. Not overly hot, obviously, but you can raise it by a couple of degrees and just help them with little things like that. Offer them lukewarm water instead of cold water.
And maybe I should expand on why I'm anti-heating a barn. My whole career, the problem isn't necessarily heating the barn. The problem is what happens when we heat the barn. If we heat the barn in the winter, people will turn down their ventilation because they're going to expend a lot of burning liquid propane or natural gas to create the heat for the barn. So as a result, they're not going to want to put in as much fresh outside air because it's cold, and then it's going to increase their heating costs. So in almost every single heated barn that I've ever experienced, the ventilation rates are inadequate. The humidity is high, the bacteria levels are high, the noxious gas levels are high. And when I talk to the farmer and say, your calves are getting very sick with pneumonia, we need to get more fresh air in this barn, their comment is, yeah, but that'll cost me a lot of money to heat. And my comment is, yes, but your calves would be better off to just get rid of the heat. Don't even worry about heating the barn and get more fresh air in here. And so I guess I should, just for the audience, I should specify, it's not so much a problem with the heat itself. It's that heated barns typically have inadequate ventilation rates because of the expense associated with it. And we could circumvent the whole thing by just not worrying about heating the barn and getting more fresh air in the barn and just keep the calves warm with calories, jackets, and bedding.
And sometimes I also have barns where especially in retrofit situations, where the farmers then are worried about their pipes. That it's like freezing their pipes and that they are not insulated enough. So the whole barn needs to be insulated to keep the water system running. And I would recommend to not focus so much on that in that specific moment, but like try to make the calves comfortable with enough fresh air and good air quality, and then see if you maybe can insulate the pipe system with spray foam or solutions like that to not have the whole barn with the calves in it.
And that's always the problem with heated barns is typically an air quality issue because of lack of ventilation.
Absolutely. Okay, let's see what else we have. Okay, so we have a question here about metal cages. So we see that very often in countries like the Middle East. So not pens like that, but like pens that basically have gates on the side, individual pens, and then open walls. Kind of what can you add like mechanical ventilation, like positive pressure tubes to pens like that too, or?
Yeah, the metal grates do serve one positive function in the fact that they're very easy to ventilate and airflow can be moved through them very easily. The negative that they have is calf-to-calf contact, and that's where I think a solution like the Agroplastics Ultraflex pen is better. We get our two solid sidewalls so the calves cannot touch each other. That's a biosecurity positive. But then we have very open and breathable end walls, and that allows for air to come through. So I think that's a good thing. As far as the giant windows, I have been in enough barns with a fair amount of window space. I still typically, in my experience when I've been in those barns, they still don't have generally enough adequate airflow through the windows. Even a bank of windows on a wall, it still only provides a fraction of the surface area that an open curtain would provide. And so most of the barns that I've been in, when they have every single window open, we still find some deficiencies in air quality in the barn. And I typically recommend supplementing those with mechanical.
And often it's a perception kind of problem because we're like, I don't know, I'm like 5 feet something tall. And so when I'm standing in front of a window that is usually next to the walkway, very typical barn design, for example, in Germany would be walkway on one side of the barn with windows and then on the other side packed straw, like in this picture here, but with a solid back wall. And if you're standing in that alley with your head literally next to that window that's open, you're maybe even saying like, ooh, it's a little drafty here. Like we need to like angle the windows or something to like slow that air down and stuff like that. And you feel like there's really good air quality in this barn because you're breathing that fresh air from that window directly. But by definition, you will have a very high knee wall because the window will not start anything between 3 or 4 feet off the ground, probably even higher. And the calf, it's a long way from that window to that calf down in the pen and at the end of the pen. And that's where all the noxious gases and humidity is coming from that straw pack what the calf is sitting on. So you're right at the best possible spot of ventilation in that barn, and the calf is in the worst possible spot. And you can't really tell that it is like that unless you go into the pen and like kind of crouch down onto calf level. So here's a question about the manure cleaning system of these barns. And I think all the barns that we've shown here, either if it's individual pens or group pens like this, will have some sort of packed bedding, usually straw. Sometimes it's wood shaving, wood chips, or I even know from Barak that they're using some like cotton kind of deal in Israel. So some kind of organic matter that is there to absorb the moisture and insulate the calf when it's laying down nesting into it. And it will pack down over time with fresh bedding added on top of it. And then you will have some kind of equipment to be able to clean it. So the pens are very easy in that manner. They're a complete freestanding solution. So you don't need any kind of like concreted in posts to mount them to. So you can just dismantle them and then take your skid loader, your tractor with the bucket, with a front loader, whatever it is you have, and just kind of scrape the manure out of the barn, load it up in a bucket and get it out. That's usually also you're determining heights of the knee wall, kind of like how high your bedded pack is. So when you have the knee wall like this, that you come with a bucket, push against it and scoop up. And you don't really want it to be much lower than that scoop because otherwise all the manure is going to fall out. So you want it so you can scoop up and get the manure out. But you usually need some kind of extra equipment to drive in and scoop it out.
Most knee walls on a post-weaned calf barn bedded pack, most of the knee walls are still only made 2 feet tall, and we find that that provides plenty of knee wall to push up against for a buck wall for cleaning, and provides enough capacity to allow calves to stay there for a couple months before it has to be cleaned up.
And especially for like post-wean calves like that, it will be packed down pretty good, and then you can usually have a grab bucket that you can like drive in and grab it and drive out. With the baby calves, the straw tends to be a lot more loose and less packed down, so there you need the scraping up much more. But yeah, there's no like automatic cleaning manure system in it, like maybe in a dairy barn. I don't know. I don't think anybody's thinking about that. Maybe if you have a bigger barn like this, you can have a scraper here on the concrete, but that is really more post-weaned, getting into the kind of young stock situation barns. Okay, I think those are the questions that we wanted to have answered. Is there, just gonna check the. There we go. Okay, I think those are the questions for now. As a little lookout, so like I said, this 3rd edition of the Stages of Cow, we're gonna go on into the blue area of the cows. So we're gonna talk about young stock, we're gonna talk about how to prepare heifers for their lives in freestone barns, how to like get them used to cubicles and stuff like that, and what is the right solutions for that. Yeah, I want to thank everyone for their attention.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Ryan, for taking the time to be here and answer.